Paleontologists describe a fascinating new reptile, a tiny creature from New Haven, Connecticut with a giant head, found decades ago by paleontologists, but now paleontologists have new insights into why this animal is so cool.
Like, one of the things I love about the story is it's kind of like, I see where things could go in the future.
And fortunately, one of the paleontologists who worked on that is here with us, our very own co-host, Adam Pritchard. So, Adam, what can you tell us about Colobops noviportensis?
Oh, I'd like to think I can tell you a lot of things about Colobops, and I will. I'm Adam Pritchard.
I'm Matt Bortz.
And I'm Catherine Early, and this is Pastime. So, Adam, how did this specimen end up making its way across your desk?
Well, it started a very long time ago. But I won't go back to 212 million years ago when Colobops was first buried in the rock near New Haven, Connecticut. I'll go back to 1965. During construction in a highway north of New Haven, Connecticut, construction workers discovered a piece of sandstone rock that encased within it a skull of a tiny reptile just about an inch long embedded in the rock. That specimen didn't really do much for quite a while. It ended up in the collections of the Yale Peabody Museum and stayed there for quite some time, until the 1990s when the skull was prepared out and initially described by actually my current supervisor at the Smithsonian Institution, Dr. Hans-Dieter Seuss.
Yes, he is Dr. Seuss.
And Donald Baird. And they considered it a relative of a kind of obscure modern-day reptile called a tuatara, a relative of modern lizards. And that's where the story stayed for quite some time. I first saw this tiny little skull in the collections at the Peabody about 2010, so almost, is that right? Oh my God.
Yeah.
I first saw this skull in the collections of the Peabody almost 10 years ago, which makes me old too.
All of us.
Oh. Anyway, I first saw this little skull when I was first starting my dissertation project in the basement of the Peabody Museum, and it kind of captured my attention. But I didn't know much about reptile anatomy then, so I could just kind of look at it and say, wow, that thing's tiny. Oh well. Quite a few years later, after I finished my dissertation, I came to work in the lab of Anjan Bular, professor of geology at Yale, as a postdoctoral fellow. And in the Bular lab, we take a lot of information about both fossil and modern animals and try to integrate that together to get a better sense of what biology was like in the past. And that really gave me a new way to look at this tiny skull of this reptile and basically take the next step in our understanding of it in science.
Adam, I love the name of this thing.
It's so great.
I do too.
Colobops noviportensis. Why did you choose that name?
Well, very early in the project, the fossil that would eventually be called Colobops got a nickname, Stubby. And I always wanted, once, like, everyone started calling it Stubby, which was great. And I really wanted that to be a part of its name in reference to the just tiny snout this thing has. So, working with co-author Michael Hanson, who's just absolutely in love with languages, we developed a Greek version of the name, which means shortened face. Colobops. Noviportensis is a Latinized version of the name New Haven.
Port, meaning a place where you park a boat, and haven is a word for where you park a boat in a bunch of Northern European languages.
And this thing was discovered in New Haven County, north of New Haven, Connecticut, where the Peabody Museum is located. And so that was the species name, Colobops noviportensis.
One of the things that really surprised me when you first described this specimen in this project to me, Adam, was that it's from New Haven, Connecticut. When I think of the kind of work that you do, and really reptile fossil hunting writ large, I think of it as something that happens in the western part of the United States. But here there's an East Coast thing. Did you ever think you'd be wrapped up in New England reptile paleontology?
So for a long time, dating back to when I started looking at fossils at 2 years old, I kind of had the same bias, the sense that the western part of North America, with its vast deserts and plains, was where you go to find fossils. And that in the East Coast, we had nothing. As a Maryland native, I was very excited to discover that there actually are some very rare dinosaur fossils and Mesozoic fossils around here. But there's just not nearly as much known, in part because the eastern half of the country is pretty green. It's covered in a lot of vegetation. It's also very much more developed, with parking lots and cities and all kinds of human developments sitting on top of the rock layers. But every once in a while, those rock layers do produce.
And this is something that we get asked a lot as paleontologists, is why deserts tend to be places where we find fossils. And part of the reason for that is that fossils are rare in rocks. And if you go 6 feet to the next fossil from the one discovery to the next, in a desert, if you don't have plants covering that 6 feet, then you can find that next fossil kind of poking out of the ground. Whereas if there are shrubs and grass and a parking lot in between you and the next 6 feet, then you're not going to find the next fossil. So we're really reliant on the East Coast in these kinds of road cuts and kind of when we actually burrow into the rock for some kind of developmental or construction stuff. So appropriately, this thing was found by a construction crew working on a highway. And that's just East Coast paleontology.
So that's a good point about the environments where we find fossils today. But Adam, what was the environment where this thing was living like back when it was alive?
Well, I talked in my episode about Ghost Ranch about sort of how the west of North America during the Triassic period was this dry, seasonal environment that was subject to really extremes in temperature with forest fires and things like that. But the eastern United States at that time wasn't really like that. It was wetter. It was a much more almost tropical environment. And we see a diversity of animals there, some of which are very similar to the ones out west. We see the crocodile-like phytosaurs with their nostrils up on top of their head. We see armored herbivores, the aedosaurs, walking around. But we also get a diversity of small animals, and Colobops is one of those.
So you say it's small, like an inch long, like the skull is only about an inch long. How did you work on this specimen?
So when the specimen was initially described in the scientific literature in the 1990s, it was prepared out, but only the outer surfaces of all of the bones. Everything inside was still embedded in the rock because all those structures are so small and so fragile that to clean them out would be to potentially damage the specimen and disarticulate all the bones, to pull them all apart. At the Bullar lab, we use CT scanning to get data on the insides of specimens, both modern and fossil, and that's how we approached the Colobops specimen. We micro-CT scanned it and then ran it through a computer program to digitally pull out all of the individual bones without harming the specimen. And so we can see not only those outer surfaces that could be seen during the initial description, but all of the data on the insides of every single bone in the skull to really understand how the thing is fitted together.
So once you had the CT data and you had processed it, what did you learn from the specimen?
Well, once we were able to really get at the three-dimensional anatomy of a lot of the bones, we started to notice some things that made Colobops pretty distinct from a lot of the other reptiles of the same scale that lived during the early part of the Mesozoic. For one, at the front of its snout, all of the bones are really solidly braced against one another in a way that suggests the snout on this thing is super well reinforced.
Now, why would you want a super well-reinforced snout?
Well, a reinforced snout is a really good adaptation for dealing with powerful forces on that snout, such as the forces that come from a powerful bite. And one of the things we saw when we saw the three-dimensional anatomy of the skull, especially behind the eyes, was that the chambers for all of the jaw closing muscles in Colobops are really, really large. Like, kind of stupidly large. The thing's head is almost triangular, widening behind the eyes, suggesting that whatever it was doing, it had a really powerful bite and a skull built to deal with those forces.
Are there other animals that have heads that are built that way, that are alive today?
So in many ways, Colobops' skull is put together in a way that's very similar to a modern lizard. In some ways, it resembles an iguana. In some ways, it resembles that lizard relative, the tuatara. But the sheer width and volume of those jaw muscle chambers are just absolutely remarkable. We put together a whole data set filled with both fossil and living reptile measurements to look at the size of those chambers. And Colobops, for its body size, is just absolutely leaps and bounds ahead of anything fossil or living. Whatever this thing was doing at that tiny scale, it was biting really, really hard.
But what was it eating that it needed this?
That is a great question, and it's something that really will only be resolved with another Colobops skull. What's great about this specimen is that it's almost complete and it's articulated. What's bad about it is what it's missing. Colobops' skull is sort of shaved off just above its teeth. So we have no teeth whatsoever preserved on this skull, which is a huge disappointment because it not only would help us pin down where it goes in the tree of life, but it would also really help us figure out what exactly it was using those jaw muscles to bite down on. At that scale, most modern reptiles are doing some combination of eating small prey like insects, and it's probable that Colobops would have been doing something similar, just apparently insects or prey with particularly hard shells.
Do we know enough about the insect fossil record of the time to know if they happen to have particularly hard shells?
There are some amazing sites in Virginia from about the same time that Colobops lived that show us that insects were incredibly diverse and just all over the place at this point in the Triassic. So if Colobops was an insectivore, an insect-eating animal, it would have had a huge variety of prey to choose from.
So we're dealing with a tiny lizard-like animal with a short little snoot that's really strong and a really massive area for the muscles it uses to close the jaw. Are there animals related to Colobops, either in the fossil record or alive today, that have that kind of combination of features?
What's striking is there's actually quite a few animals that accomplish something similar. Modern iguanas do something similar to this, as do the tuataras, the sort of distant lizard relatives that we referenced earlier, and there are some fossil reptiles that accomplish something similar. All of these animals that have these super enlarged jaw muscles are quite a bit bigger than Colobops. If we just look at those animals, especially if we just look at the modern animals, we would think that such enormous dedication to these sorts of this sort of jaw closing anatomy would be something you only see in an animal with a skull that's maybe twice the size of what we see in Colobops. So in many ways, Colobops does resemble conditions that we see in both fossil and modern reptiles. But because it's so much smaller than those similar animals, it sort of expands our understanding of what the skulls of animals can look like.
So Adam, this work is really cool, but I do have to say, whenever I see a CT scanned beautiful skull, it seems kind of incomplete without a brain endocast.
I would have loved to make a 3D brain space out of this Colobops specimen, but you actually hit on some of the things that we weren't able to do. Unfortunately, some of the fine structures that would have housed its brain were really difficult to see, even with the incredible CT scans we were able to get. So I think there's still some mysteries left to resolve with the Colobops specimen, including the kind of anatomy of that housing for its brain, some of the fine structures that would have supported its kind of sensory apparatus. There's still a lot of mysteries to resolve with this specimen. And heck, if more specimens are discovered in the future, that will resolve all kinds of things that we don't understand about Colobops. This isn't the final statement on this animal. This is kind of delving into it with the modern technology that we have and the modern context of vertebrate anatomy, giving it a name, and then hopefully a future researcher will find new ways to look at the specimen or new specimens to integrate into an analysis to really solve more mysteries with Colobops.
For images of Colobops and some of its relatives and a link to the paper, visit pastime.org. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. And with that, my name is Matt Bortz.
I'm Adam Pritchard.
And I'm Catherine Early, and we'll see you next time on Pastime.
I want to get
okay.
Colobops in before we get to music, because it's such a good... I don't know. I just want to say Colobops as much as I can.
Yes.
It's fun to say, isn't it?